right, well, good afternoon. Good afternoon as our esteemed panel comes to join us on the stage. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being with us for this session. You're really in for a treat. We have a rare opportunity here to speak with former government officials from each of the three North American countries, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And through chatting in the back halls, they are able to speak their mind to some extent, still feeling some loyalties to the decorum of being officials, of course. But it does give us an opportunity, since they are speaking on their own personal capacities, to get a little bit past the talking points and to hear from the perspective of people in the know how these different countries are approaching questions about energy in the context of the USMCA. So the central question for our discussion today is really about whether North America and these three nations will be able to meet the moment. We are blessed in the continent, in each of the three countries, with enormous energy resources. And traditionally, we've had integrated markets. We have a lot going for us. The question is, in this increasingly fragmented world, can we work together, and what lies ahead with the USMCA? So I'd like to spend just a few moments introducing our panel, because we do just have such a wealth of information. I want you to really understand who you have the privilege of hearing from and learning from today. I know I'm very excited to learn from these three impressive individuals. And I'll start with Antonio Ortiz Mena. Antonio is president and CEO of AOM Advisors and a non-resident fellow of the Atlantic Council with its Latin American Center. And at his firm, he provides strategic counsel on geopolitics, trade, and foreign investments to clients across energy and manufacturing. From 2007 to 2015, he led economic affairs at the Embassy of Mexico right here in Washington, D.C. Great. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Great. Next, we have Kimberly Breyer. She is former Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. She brings more than 20 years of foreign policy experience and was previously the founder and director of the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative and Deputy Director of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She served at the White House in the National Security Council early in her career, holds an MA from Georgetown and a BA from Middlebury in Spanish, and has a daughter who's studying astrophysics. And then our third panelist is Jay Khosla. Welcome, Jay. Jay is the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Policy at Canada's Public Policy Forum. He has decades of experience as a senior public service leader, including 10 years as the Assistant Deputy Minister. All right, excellent. For the Government of Canada for energy. He is, in fact, one of Canada's leading experts in the energy sector. Has worked with numerous cabinet ministers, from Rick Perry to Ernie Moniz here in the U.S. as part of his counterparts, and has also advised countless private sector and international stakeholders. And he holds a degree in history from the University of Ottawa and a master's degree in public administration from Dalhousie. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Now, I'd like to start at 30,000 feet. We know that we're at a moment where global energy supply chains are, to put it mildly, being reorganized. Countries are increasingly competing for investment for everything from manufacturing to critical minerals, energy infrastructure, and advanced technologies. So, as I mentioned previously, North America has abundant energy resources and has a tradition of integrated markets. And we're at this moment where we are taking another look at the USMCA framework. And the question, I think the larger question for our session overall is, can we meet the moment? And the question I'd like to start with and put to each of the panelists is this a strategic moment? And what I mean by that is, as we are looking at a review of USMCA, is this a different kind of conversation than just a standard trade negotiation. So, Antonio, what do you think?
I would say this really is a different moment, and let me give just a brief context. Going back to the original Canada-US FTA, late 80s, there was a proportionality clause, Article 904, which was no go for Mexico. Under Article 904 of the Canada-US FTA, it didn't mention Canada, but it was obvious that Canada was exporting oil to the US. Canada could not reduce oil exports to the US unless it reduced its domestic availability, proportionality, Mexico said that's a no-go. So extremely important for trade and security in the original one. Second, for Mexico, it was not only no go for that, but no for oil exploration and exploitation. And I think that to a large extent, the exclusion of energy, except for secondary petrochemicals in NAFTA, is what allowed to go NAFTA to go through the Mexican Congress and the Mexican body politic. We kept it out. I would say it was partly out, but we said it's too important to keep it in. It must be out. Under USMCA, there was originally an energy chapter, but as negotiations proceeded and López Obrador won the presidency, the energy chapter turned into like a two senses chapter, chapter 8, saying Mexico's sovereign and everything relating to energy has to be consistent with the Mexican Constitution. I thought that every treaty or agreement had to be consistent with the Constitution. So for me, it means nothing. The Peña Nieto reforms were grandfathered, even though the president, López Obrador, insisted energy was out. No, it's in, completely in. Thinking about soccer, we can use the immediate repetition VAR. It's in. It's not out. It's in. Okay, now what happens going forward? I think that we will meet the moment, but maybe not when we need to, maybe a little bit slowly and a little bit late. And I'll just give three ideas. I'll shut up briefly. Why I think this is a different moment. Number one, 6 years ago, the geopolitical situation was fraught, but it is not what it is now. Right now, it is incredibly volatile and unstable, and the UN, the WTO, IMF are weaker now, I think, than they were 6 years ago, not to mention WHO, whatever. Number two, the level of nationalism that we have now and protectionism is much higher than it was 6 years ago. And thirdly, I'm sure you spent half the panel speaking about AI. We didn't use ChatGPT to analyze the USMCA originally, right? So it is a new world.
Wow, a lot to react to there. I'm going to turn to Jay next. And in particular, I know that some of the things that our colleague has alluded to, you've been advising your government about. So, Jay, your thoughts?
Antonio's reminding me of some movies I've lived that I don't want to see the sequel to, namely the NAFTA provision. Not many people remember that. I think that's critical, like that NAFTA had that, and there was a huge debate on proportionality and provisionality. But we should be proud, though, at the end of the day, that we got somewhere with that. And I think those are building blocks, especially, and also the annex letter on, we call it CUSMA, you call it USMCA. I know Antonio has a different acronym for that, but that energy annex did have some provisions in it that are worth building on. And I think that's really what's important when we talk about going forward. The simple answer to your question in my mind first is absolutely this is a critical moment. It's a critical moment for a continent. Like if you just look at our trading relationships, we're one of the biggest trading blocks in the world, if not the largest when you think about the three nations. And the question is not whether we're doing well in this space. Like if you look at the markets, if you look at the supply chains, they're doing what they need to do and they're integrating and they continue to integrate. But if you look at the policies and the strategies that are being pursued by the three governments at this moment in time, unfortunately, they're headed in different directions. So the policy is not, in my mind, keeping pace with the actuality of what's really happening out there. And at the end of the day, I think as a policy person, I think it's important for us to educate folks. And so I just want to run a set of ticker tape of stats that I think are critical for anybody who's thinking through this stuff, because the data speaks for itself, right? Like we're enabled by infrastructure Canada, US. We have 70 to 80 pipelines across our borders, 30 transmission lines. In the US, And I didn't hear too much of this today, and it kind of disappointed me. But a lot of talk about energy abundance and energy sovereignty and energy security. Not one mention of Canada is playing a key role in that. 66% of US oil imports come from Canada. Like 20% of your system on oil runs because of Connect Canada. And we are integrated the other way as well. You export, most of our oil imports come from the US. That's terrific, right? It means things are working the way they should. 99% of your imports of natural gas come from Canada. Electricity, 100% of Canada's electricity exports go to the US. We power the island of Manhattan. That's important to know that. Uranium, 50% of Canada's uranium exports go to the United States. That supplies 1/3 of your uranium needs. And our nuclear supply chains are integrated. That SMR play, small modular reactors, is a Westinghouse Canada US play in Canada. And it's critical. And then, if that wasn't enough, 50%, 57% of your critical minerals come from Canada. So what more do we need? And I'm not going to leave Antonio out of this, okay? Because Mexico knows very well that Canadian multinational and super majors are working in the oil sector there. I can talk about TC Energy till the cows come home. I've been down there many, many times on various pipeline issues. But what you may not know is that 70% of Mexico's mining activity is run by Canadian corporations. So, and I could give you the reverse stats the other way. Texas supplying Mexican gas, but at the end of the day, we are integrated. And the question is not about whether that's a good thing. The question is, are we maximizing that advantage? And can we collectively develop a North American energy security strategy? And we've tried, but it hasn't. But as long as these tariff actions continue and these, I would call sort of short-sighted debates on whether integration is a good thing, we won't get there. And that's the moment that will be squandered, because when you look at the bigger picture in the Strait of Hormuz, and I'm sorry to keep going on, but I'm pretty passionate about this. When you look at the bigger, just imagine if we were further integrated, if we had Keystone XL, like if we had Keystone XL, we should be thinking that way. We should not be thinking the other way. And the antidote would be to look at CUSMA and get that energy chapter back to the, if we could do the World Cup very well as a trilateral, which we're doing, why can't we do that kind of stuff? So using your soccer analogy. So that would be my starting point.
That's fantastic. Kim, so let's hear your thoughts and share some of the U.S. perspective.
Thank you, and I appreciate, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for this, inviting us to this amazing event, and happy to be here with my fellow panelists. And I regret to inform you that I'm in violent agreement with both my Mexican and Canadian colleagues, and with the overall view. I think we are suffering from abundance, and I think we need to take a step back from the day-to-day debate about North America and appreciate what it is that we have. If you look today in the newspaper and any on social media, all you see is discussion of sovereignty and areas where we disagree, and the uncertainty of the review and the regulatory changes in Mexico that have caused uncertainty. All of that is true, but when you step back and look at it, I think we have to be realistic about the fact that we've built something pretty special here in North America with these three countries. We are extremely fortunate to have neighbors like Canada and Mexico and the United States, and I think we need to appreciate that from afar. And if you don't want to take my word for it, I asked AI what it thought of the USMCA review, and I asked it to be funny. And the response that I got was that the three countries are in a relationship, and they've decided to have a conversation about whether they should see other continents. and the answer is, of course, we should not see other continents. We should focus on the good things that we have here. And I would just add on the review, I understand that the USMCA review is generating quite a bit of uncertainty for the many corporations that I see in the audience here. But with that said, I would submit that having lived in Washington and under the several decades of NAFTA, not having a review also generated uncertainty. And so I think we need to appreciate that we have a mechanism. Our three governments are following it. There is a vibrant dialogue going on about things. AI didn't exist even when we wrote the USMCA, as Antonio pointed out. I think it's actually a very valuable process, and even if we don't get it done by July 1st, it seems that we may not be quite there by July 1st. My hope is that the dialogue will continue, the meetings will continue, and we will get there and we'll be able to have, at the end of the day, a modernized, updated agreement that reflects the fact that the world has changed. Do I think we're in a different moment? Yes, absolutely a different moment. And for me, the overlay that changes this conversation is it's a national security overlay. And I think it got emphasized by obviously competition with China, but it also got really driven home here in DC by COVID and the shortages of supplies and pharmaceuticals and PPE and all of the things that happened during the pandemic that we as three countries, I think, dealt with reasonably well once we got going. We had Mexico looking for a vaccine, the United States looking for PPE. I mean, everyone was going around the world looking for inputs that we didn't have. And I think that's a wake-up call. And I think that is the different framing now, that this is a conversation. Yes, it's about trade, and we're going to have professional negotiators arguing about rules of origin and what level of this or that. But ultimately, it also has a national security overlay now, which I think is I wouldn't say it's entirely new, but it's a much more prominent overlay to the conversation.
I really appreciate the optimism of bringing in the analogy to COVID times and collaboration with the World Cup and the potential for the three nations to work together. And I want to get back to the China question that you brought up, Kim. But before I do, and I completely agree that national security is such an important overlay, and potentially that is the overlay that is most appealing to this administration. But before we do, I'd like to return to just the issue of costs and competitiveness. And if you were just explaining to normal Canadian, Mexican, American citizens, what's in it for them if the countries can work together? What's to the benefit for the ordinary citizens of the three countries? What do you think, Jay?
Well, I think I'd go from 30,000 to 3,000 feet very quickly, but 30,000 feet, there's nothing like energy security. I mean, what have we been talking about here all day? And last year and the year before that, I've been lucky to be here many, many times. And that's the dream, because energy provides it is the source of everything, right? I mean, air, water, land, energy, right? That's what we have. And if we can maximize our advantage in all these various spheres, look out. Like you can create new supply chains, new orders of business. We've been talking a lot about AI. I do agree with all the commentators who've talked about the fact that we are in a race. We are. And you can't turn a blind eye to that. But imagine if the three nations got together and said, wait a second, we're not going to let China dominate it. Imagine if we got strategic and had some plans and some frameworks to use all of these resources, whether it be nuclear, whether it be gas, whether it be et cetera, like an all of the above strategy, to link it all up and make sure that we've got the labor connected to all of that. I think that's a big part of this, that we do not, and we're even short on types of skills, right? If we had that connective tissue, we would maximize this advantage. And I think then you create better economies of scale, you create regional economies, et cetera. I mean, we are in Canada right now actually moving away from that. And it kind of makes little sense to us because it's been, since our history, 200 odd years, this is what we've been doing. We don't do east-west. But right now, we have government policies that basically say, okay, tariff actions are actually damaging our economy. And I'm sorry to say, but that's a fact. And what do you do about that? You have to diversify away. It is the AI analogy. We are trying to date other continents. They may not be the continents that we always want to do, to put a ring on it with. Okay, but at the end of the day, like, it's forcing us to do that.
Yeah.
We are building infrastructure to go to Asia massively. We're looking at the EU. Big trading partner. We're trying to maximize all of our trade agreements. We have more trade agreements than we've ever had in our history. And that is unfortunate because the one trade agreement that has always mattered is this one. And so why we're doing that? Because our economy is imperiled. It shouldn't be that way. We could do much better by integrating. So we have a two-pronged strategy, not to, like, we'll never get away from the US-Mexico dynamic. That'll never happen. But there is definitely a two-pronged strategy that says, A, we're going to diversify our markets as fast as we can. B, we're going to get investment into a country much more than we've had in the last decade. And unfortunately, we haven't been building as much as we should have. And C, we're going to get our big projects going quickly. But we're not talking the ones that perhaps we should be talking north-south. Yeah.
Well, that's very powerful. And, Jay, part of what I took from your comments is that energy security is connected to energy affordability. That security means access to affordable energy. And I wonder, Antonio, do you see it the same way? Do you see that connection between the affordability issue and the national security issue?
Absolutely. For example, for those of us who spend all day too long reading about the USMCA and playing inside baseball, whatever, we forget that if we achieve the best USMCA review possible, in my view, that would be zero tariffs for every good that complies with the rules of origin and very low levels of uncertainty regarding US unilateral actions. Yes, I'm mentioning, national security trade restrictions or Section 301 for that matter. We have to cut down the level of uncertainty. But that being said, if we achieve that and we don't have enough energy that is reliable, clean, and competitively priced, what good is having that agreement? For example, if we are going to produce in the region a lot of goods that we import from China now, we will need more energy. If we are going to take advantage of the AI revolutions, we will need many more data centers and ideally redundant data centers, Canada, US, Mexico, the US. We need energy. Mexico and the US, I think in past February, signed a bilateral agreement on critical minerals, right? So Mexico has some assets. Does Mexico have enough energy to exploit those minerals where those minerals are? I'm not sure. So you can sign that agreement. If you don't have the energy, you cannot exploit it. If you don't have Canada refining, you have the minerals, but you can't refine. So I'd say if you think about production of goods, production of services, trade in goods and trade in services, and everybody is a producer and a consumer, you need energy. If you don't get this right, nothing else matter. It's so obvious that people sometimes forget about it. The rule of origin 82 or 80%. Like, who cares? If you don't resolve this, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, yeah. I had a question specifically prepared for China, and I'm really struck that all three of you have just organically gone to the China question. And Kim, maybe we can build on that. You've heard your co-panelists refer to the imperative. How do you see it? How do you see the USMCA? How much of it is a reaction to China?
I think a lot of the discussion is actually has that as an underlying. I mean, you hear discussion now of whether there should be an investment screening mechanism in Mexico like CFIUS in the United States. You hear discussion of North American content or U.S. content or the rules of origin. All of those things I think go back to the competition with China. And again, I asked AI what it thought of North American supply chains, and I asked it to be funny. And its response was the North American supply chains are like a game of Jenga being played by overly optimistic economists. One ship from Taiwan doesn't show up and the whole thing falls down. So this is what AI is telling us about where we are. It's a very precarious game of Jenga. So I think what the trade negotiators have a very difficult job because they're trying to balance American jobs, the inputs we need, the affordability agenda, which is obviously very important. We want to be able to make things efficiently so we can sell them to American consumers at prices that are affordable. At the same time, there is this national security overlay, and that is, in the rationale of the administration, the tariffs are a way to bring some of that production home that we let move overseas over time. Now, home to me as now a non-government official means in North America. I am perfectly happy buying steel and aluminum from Canada and Mexico as long as it's not being transshipped from somebody else. But I think, I hope that we're going to get there. The truth is, I'm guessing we're going to get to some sort of new status quo with USMCA, and there will still be some lingering tariffs alongside, precisely because of this national security concern that we need to be making our own products here at home. So that's the sort of balancing act. And I will say, I don't want to be overly optimistic about it, but I also am not pessimistic in the sense that we've had a list with Mexico of what, how many, 54 things, 54 and growing number of issues on the table. And I think the teams have been very quickly sort of ticking them off and moving through the various issues. And, you know, if this were a moment where we were not going to have a USMCA, I think you would have seen it already. So I think we're going to get there. I don't know what it looks like, but I think we're going to get there precisely because the national security overlay also dictates that it be so. If we want to compete with China, we have to do this. We have to figure out a way to do this. We may not do it perfectly, we may not maximize it, but I think that there is an understanding that the three of us, the three countries, are better when we're together and when we're aligned.
That was really powerful, Kim. And I want to follow up on one thing you just said because I think it's such an insider observation that other people that hadn't been close to the process wouldn't be able to share. And that is that you just shared that you felt that if it were going to fail, it would have failed already. So can you tell us a little bit about what would you have expected failure to look like if it were going to not cross the finish line? What would have happened by now?
Well, I think I was a little bit worried, I'll be honest, and I've said this in public. I was a little bit worried about Canada until recently. But now Canada and the official conversations have come. And this is, by the way, not dissimilar from how it happened last time. The US and Mexico were intensely debating the finer points of trade policy, and Canada stood and waited until the US and Mexico sort of got through some of the issues that we needed to get through, and Canada came in later. So I wasn't overly alarmed. But I had said to a publication in Canada that if I hadn't seen a meeting with Canada by June, then I was going to start really worrying because we were coming up on the July 1 deadline. And obviously now we've also seen Canada and Mexico profess that they want to stay within the continent and that they want to stay with the trade agreement. And so, you know, I think the will is there. And if the administration here in the U.S. had fully decided that it didn't want to have some kind of arrangement in North America, I think that probably would have manifested already. And just given the timing, and people are spending, I mean, the Antonio knows this better than anyone. These trade negotiations are extremely detailed and in the weeds, and people are spending an enormous amount of time and energy trying to get through these long lists of everything from digital trade to rules of origin and automotives and all things that are way beyond my capacity. So when you look at that investment, it's pretty clear to me that we're gonna end up with some sort of framework in the end, and I hope it's a trilateral one. I think it's trilateral. I hope it is.
Jay, she
Uh,
you had her worried.
y- y-
She thought you were seeing one of the other continents, I think.
I think there's some irony in saying that Canada is causing worry in this space, but
It's fair.
and I'm also really happy to hear that you're hopeful. That matters a lot. Canadians are really attuned to this conversation. It's it is like bread and butter for us. Our country is going through a complete reshaping for the first time, and the Prime Minister would argue, since its inception about where we go, and it's because of this conversation. And I do remember the last round because I was involved. I know our negotiators would not say that they sat on the sidelines. It was a very different experience in Canada. We learned a lot. We learned not to take anything for granted. And I think this time around, this whole conversation was preempted by tariff actions. And that is something that's super serious for us. Like our steel industry, I love to hear you say that. I love that.
I'm
We
no
are one
longer
of
a
the
U.S.
biggest
official, so
suppliers
I
of
can say
steel to the US of any nation, and yet our steel laborers are getting out of work because of this. Our aluminum factories are going down. This is not fun and games. So it's great that we'll get an agreement, but I do think it's not okay to have the lowest common denominator agreement. And I do think right now that set of negotiations is really being used as a proxy war for specific sectors. And I think I want to be hopeful. I was there when we signed the North American Energy MOU. I believe Rick Perry was the Secretary of Energy at the time, Jim Carr, who's a liberal in Canada, and Pedro Joaquin Coldwell in Mexico. And we were going to work hard across lines to make sure we integrated far more, and that is where we should be, not saying dairy's a problem. And the other thing I would say is, you know, we have a lot of work to do. People don't know this, but the first thing we did back then, this is only 2017, 18, that realm. We created data maps. We don't even have joint data maps here in the continent, sort of articulating where the pipelines flow north-south, where the transmission lines flow north-south, et cetera, et cetera. Rail. You wouldn't believe how much rail conveyance. When we started to look at that with Melanie Kenderdine in the Department of Energy, the maps that she created it was shocking. It was almost like we created a pipeline through rail. So these are the areas that we should be promoting and advancing. And honestly, the Mexican government, SENAR, I worked very closely with them. They wanted to create renewable supply chains. They wanted to start to understand from Canada how we did hydro. That is where we need to be. So as far as CUSMA goes, at least for energy, mining, and critical minerals, they should be exempt. Just exempt. There should be a chapter in there in my mind. And I wanted it the last time. I would fight hard for it again if I was still around. The main point is, and anything else that creates wealth in this trading block should be exempt. Now, luckily, you're right. Most things are still exempt, so we're okay. But let's not go downwards. Let's go upwards.
Well, that's really well said, Jay. And I really appreciate you pushing back and my lightheartedness about
Not at all.
Canada having us
Not
worried
at all.
because you're so right. I mean, there's a huge context there that there are very good reasons why Canada may have thought very deeply about whether to engage. So really well taken. And I really also appreciate the ticker tape, I think you called it, of data about just how connected we are. And one part that caught my ear in particular was a very well made point about uranium. And you just mentioned critical minerals. So I'd love to go there next. So clearly, I think that everyone believes that we have an opportunity to build supply chains and critical minerals as a broad class, as a concept. But I would love to get your thoughts as experts. Is there a particular critical mineral or minerals that you are especially worried about that we could get this wrong?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you guys want to start but I think you know where I'll go on this one.
Yeah, why don't you kick us off, Jay?
Well, like, I mean, just look at China's dominating the market. Cobalt, lithium. Just look at the stats on that. I have them here on paper, but forget it. It's enormous, and we're sitting here watching it happen. And I call it the OPECing of critical minerals. That's literally what's happening, except for it's monopolistic. Okay, it's one nation that is kind of owning the market, and the rest of us are sitting around because we're market-oriented systems, watching it. It's been recognized by the G7. We've signed a pact there to try and solve that problem. We have all of the resources we need, and again, we can't put those building blocks together. But it's not that hard in my mind. We're talking about project-based activity. Like that's where we should go on all of this. Like where are the mines across this region? What do they look like? Which ones do we want to promote? I think it's the Department of National Defense that has invested in 2 Canadian mines, critical minerals mines, sort of early exploration. That's a very positive sign. But at the end of the day, we have to get our value added going in this continent, and we don't have it. It's a smelting question. And to get technical, that's what it is. It's a processing question. We're not even close to that, you know. And meanwhile, China is going gangbusters in that space, and so we in Canada export a lot there. And does that make sense geopolitically? And shouldn't there be a premium on this geopolitically, in the continent? But again, I kind of wonder from a CUSMA angle, where's that conversation, right?
Yeah. And how about Antonio from the Mexican perspective or your own expert perspective? Are there particular critical minerals that you in particular stay awake at night worrying about how we're going to get our act together as a continent?
There's one, lithium. Mexico has lithium in the northwest, state of Sonora, among other regions. And the previous government decided it would, take full control of lithium reserves and production. They have it Lithiumex. And the end result is that we have the lithium underground, and it'll be safely underground for many decades unless we change a policy. So I think we have to be much more realistic. Yes, focus on sovereignty. Yes, I'm nationalist as anyone else. I'll be rooting for El Tri, which is the Mexican team, and the soccer competition. But I think we have to be super sharp, super smart. Do we want foreign investment there? I would say yes. The question is from whom? For example, from our friends the Canadians or the US have maybe joint investment. Canada has refining capacity. So for me, the number one question is actually lithium. And that's symbolic because of what happened during the previous government with Lithium X. Now, let me take one step back. When I think about trade and investment and negotiations, I see countries like Korea or Japan that are energy dependent or food dependent or that they have an old demographics. In North America, we're basically food self-sufficient. We have food security, we have critical minerals and refining capacity, we have demographic complementarity, and we are basically energy self-sufficient across the matrix. So other countries are trying to achieve what we don't have. And in North America, the table is set. We have everything there, and we are bumbling. Honestly, when there's geopolitical stability, AI revolution, everything is set. I'm frustrated and optimistic at the same time.
That seems very fair. Yes. Kim, how about you? Are there particular critical minerals that you worry more about than others?
I mean, sort of all of the above. What comes to my mind is copper, which Mexico also has an abundant supply, and so do we here in the United States. And it's very difficult here, as it is in Mexico, to actually get that out of the ground and then to process it. And as Jay was mentioning, the processing and smelting is really the area where I think the Chinese have monopolized, and we need to do better. I fully agree with Antonio. The table is set, everything's there. The fact that we have a bilateral critical minerals framework between the United States and Mexico now is wonderful, but why isn't Canada in it? And clearly that's just something that we should be in addition to the USMCA conversation. It matters a lot less to me whether it's in the USMCA or whether it's adjacent to the USMCA or whether it's an annex to the USMCA or whether it's a side letter to the USMCA. Whatever the mechanism, there should be a trilateral critical minerals agreement. I mean, we have the best miners in the world in Canada, some of the most prominent companies, deeply invested in Mexico, as Jay pointed out, and in the United States. And here we are having a bilateral conversation that should be a trilateral conversation. So I think we have to dare to go there. And I would say the same on energy. I'll be a little bit critical of the previous administration here in the U.S., and not for political reasons, but because we had pretty fundamental changes going on in both the energy and mining sectors in Mexico, and the U.S. sort of punted and kept kicking the can down the road rather than having the discussion. Mexico has the sovereign right to change its constitution, to change its laws, to do whatever it likes to do. But at the end of the day, if it impacts the agreements that we have, the USMCA agreement, I think we should have had a conversation about it at the time. I think they did eventually sort of get to the point where we were having the conversation, but very late in the previous administration. And I think we need to take advantage now of this moment with USMCA and put all of that on the table. Energy needs to be on the table, critical minerals need to be on the table, and we need to figure out whatever the mechanisms are, whatever works in the real world, given the different political differences that we have among the three governments. Whatever the mechanism, we need to have some kind of mechanism for trilateral coordination on these things. And I'll just throw out a couple of pieces of data, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But on the Mexican side, I've spent a lot of time on it, and I've had a hard time understanding sort of the sovereignty piece of it. And I understand that it's about hydrocarbons and the way Chapter 8 was concluded during the previous negotiation. But at the same time, Mexico imports 70% of its natural gas and 70% of its refined fuels. To fund to drive the electrical grid and the Mexican economy. So we're already integrated. So why not have a conversation about it that respects Mexican sovereignty but recognizes the reality that we live in? And that's the part. I mean, I've studied this for many years, and I'm obviously aware of the history. But I just think we've got to get to the point where we can have that conversation where people feel comfortable having that conversation. And unfortunately, it's been very hard.
I just one quick point because I really love what you said. So the question becomes, what does that framework look like, and what's incorporated in it? And Antonio, I really liked your point about demographics. I always think about that because Mexico is much younger than the other two nations. We've got aging pop in Canada, where I think our average age is 40 or 41 now. That's kind of a thing. So what would you do in this area? Well, we've got the resource base in Canada. You'd acknowledge that. What do you have in the US? You have the investment and the technology and the capital. And what do you have? you have the ability to process all this stuff potentially. That's what an integrated framework could look like. And how hard can that be, for nations that are so like-minded and have been for a long time?
Well, I can't think of a better closing word for this. I think you all three have made such an amazing case for the strength of the three nations working together. And Antonio, as you've said, the table is set. You've all made your case for this being a critical moment. I know that all of you are in the position to advise. And so I think everyone in the audience will agree with me that we hope that the officials in Ottawa and Washington and Mexico City listen to what you have to say. So please join me in thanking our panelists.